Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Thursday, October 17th, 2024, and today we are going to be taking a look at a 2024 presidential election prediction. My last one was on October 10th, 2024, and to be quite honest with you, not much has changed about the fundamental trajectory of the race, besides the fact that this race at its core is truly too close to call. But in the nature of my channel, and I've been making these election predictions since 2018, it's time to embark on this journey of a 2024 electoral map in analyzing all of these battleground states, analyzing all of these safe states, and coming forth with a conclusive election prediction roughly 3 weeks out from the presidential election. And today actually marks less than 3 weeks. We're talking roughly 19 days between now and November, and we're getting close to the end of the evening. I apologize, first of all, for a late upload. I typically don't like to upload videos super late, at least not my first one. I'm hopefully going to have two out today. Ideally, this one at the bare minimum, but looking at where we are in the 2024 election, it truly is down to the wire. And now what you might know from the political betting markets, from the 538 forecast, from the race to the White House forecast, from all these different sites, betting markets, political prediction units, polling, pundits, all of it says one thing. This race is the closest race we have seen in a very long time in American politics, arguably even closer than the 2000 presidential election that was decided by a margin of 271 to 267, with Republicans winning that election being one of the closest we have seen in the past half century. And this election might actually even be closer. There are non-zero chances, actually significant chances, that Kamala Harris is able to win the election with just 270 electoral votes, or that Donald Trump is roughly even with that of George W. Bush with 271 or slightly over at 272 electoral votes. This election, again, is going to come down to the wire in all these battleground states, and so we're just going to spend some time analyzing how they are expected to go today, the reasons why they might be voting the way they are today, and I also want us to consistently recognize that these predictions are snapshots in time. What does the race say about today, October 17th? We can use that to compare the numbers back in September and August and July and June, because those numbers are equally as relevant just in analyzing the trend line of American politics and the trend line of election performance for Democrats and Republicans across the country. And what we know, and this is standard to every beginning of my election video, we start off by characterizing the safe Democratic and Republican states. These are states that no matter how much the country shifts, no matter which candidate wins the election, these states will be decided by a margin that is similar to that of a safe characterization of 15 points or higher, at least 15 points or higher. And what that means is that across the country, the Democrats and the Republicans have their core constituencies that, to reiterate, no matter who wins the election, will be voting for their respective candidate. No matter not only who wins the election, no matter who is running, will vote for the respective party. They have been characterized as such right now, no matter what. They aren't going to change. New York's never going to be a Republican state on the presidential level, at least not for the foreseeable future, and absolutely not in 2024. Same thing for, Republicans. They're not going to see Utah flip to the Democratic Party anytime soon, especially not in this election. And so when we're looking at those data points and looking at those numbers, what we know, the majority of this country, when it comes down to electoral vote count, really isn't making a decision, and it's already made this decision 12 years ago. So 113 electoral votes for Donald Trump, 181 for Kamala Harris. Let's continue down the 244 toss-up remaining electoral votes. Now, spoiler alert, they're not all toss-ups. They're not all competitive states. What they are, though, are slightly less than safe. And what that means is that these states will be at least decided by a margin of less than 15 points. So you're going to find that some states will be decided by less than a point. Some states will be decided by 10 points. The great thing is we have this likely characterization, which characterizes any state between 5.1% to 15%, anywhere within that range. Generally speaking, we know how these states are going to go, but it wouldn't be out of reality expectations should Democrats end up winning some of these states. These are states like South Carolina, which might be a huge shock to many people, but it wouldn't be a statistical impossibility versus states, again, like Nebraska or Wyoming that just simply aren't going to go to the Democrats. So South Carolina is one of those states that we characterize as likely Republican. We also include the state of Alaska. At this point, these states have been pretty solid for the GOP. They aren't really going to budge. I've been also pretty consistent in my election predictions. I fully expect Florida, now as of recent, to be a likely Republican state. Donald Trump is starting to shore up some of this support in the battleground states. It's a negligible change, but a slight improvement regardless in these Republican states. Iowa and Ohio are the same way. Those are going to be likely Republican states. Maine 2nd District's going to be likely Republican. Now I'm going to move back to Texas, which I used to characterize as lean red. I now want to move it back into the likely Republican column. I think we're right on that cusp where Republicans are are probably going to be on par with that of the 2020 election margin, which isn't phenomenal for Democrats, but they're still keeping the race within about 5 to 6 points. Overall, not something that they should necessarily celebrate, but something to look forward ahead, that in a better circumstance of elections, where they've had a nominee who has been here for quite some time, all of these different things, whatever it might be, looking at the 2024 election, Texas is probably going to be a state that Donald Trump wins by a very similar margin to that of 2020. Sorry about that, my screen recorder cut out, but I was essentially just talking about the other battleground states extending beyond these likely Republican ones, and how there were some likely Democratic states too that were equally as important to filling out this electoral map, as they give us a better context of what the actual core battleground states are. Now, if you've been watching my election predictions for quite some time, you're probably annoyed at this point. I promise you we're not going to spend too much time talking about the likely blue states. Not much really has changed from these states. Some new headlines that we've seen out of states like New Hampshire. A new poll today released shows Kamala Harris with roughly a 9-point advantage. That speaks generally for some better news nationwide. I can't say the same numbers have been coming out of the battleground states that are truly the most important in the election. We've been seeing a lot of whiplash. Today, actually, one poll in particular I wanted to point out as something that honestly struck me as quite shocking. It isn't this that, just that Donald Trump leads by 2 points nationally on the Fox News poll. That really isn't too surprising to me. It was a 2-point lead for Kamala Harris before. It's a 2-point lead for Donald Trump now. What ended up being a 4-point shift, they actually released their swing state numbers that found that Kamala Harris across the swing states led by roughly 6 points across the 7 battlegrounds. And these aren't just battleground states that are like Virginia or New Mexico. These aren't Democratic battleground states. These are battleground states that truly will determine the future of the country and are 50-50 right now, according to every other pollster. And so for Fox News to come out and say Donald Trump leads by 2 nationally, yet Kamala Harris leads in 6 out of the 7 battleground states and by 6 points on average, I don't know what to believe. In certain cases, I do think, though, that there is some merit in taking in some of these shifts that we have seen towards the former president, while acknowledging that there are individual strength points for Kamala Harris's campaign that could result in her winning some of these battleground states, even if she isn't necessarily running up the national numbers like Biden did, or arguably even on par with that of Hillary Clinton, which ended up being an electoral college loss for Democrats then that might translate to a victory this time around. But I'm not here to say that Kamala Harris is going to win this election just yet. I don't even know if that's going to be the conclusion of this, plainly put. I think that this election today is closer than it was a week ago. It's closer than it was 2 weeks ago. And while I'm not going to say that the race hasn't always been close, because it has been, this race is tightening, right? This race is getting to a point where the polling averages are leading instead of a 2-point lead. It went to a 1-point lead a week ago. We're getting to a point where now it's roughly a 0.5-point lead. These polls are giving me whiplash. They're giving everybody whiplash. It really has become much more difficult on how to predict, but you can start to see some trend lines here. And for the most part, they do favor the former president. So 94 remaining toss-up electoral votes. Let's go ahead and get through them. Here's what I'm going to tell you. Nebraska 2nd should have been characterized as likely blue at this point. What I'm going to tell you is that there are no lean states at this point, really, for either candidate. I do think that these races are going to be some of the most competitive of the election cycle. They are going to require millions upon millions of dollars in the final stretch of the campaign season in order to win. I don't know if any of these states are going to be decided by more than a point this close to the election. And I do think by the time we reach election day, I will absolutely have some states in the lean column. I don't deny that. But I think where we are today, given that we have seen some catch-up in terms of minority growth in some of the battleground states for Kamala Harris, and a pullback in some core support in some other battleground states, the races here have gotten to a point where everything is coming down to the wire. Every single moment has mattered for both campaigns. Every decision they have made will likely change the future. Anything changed would have resulted in the 2024 election looking entirely different today and in November. And so I think what both campaigns have done a great job at is keeping this race competitive. I think what we saw back in 2020 was that the race sort of took away for Biden. And by the time we saw the results on Election Day, it wouldn't be that shocking to see those results a week after the election, just knowing the numbers we knew on Election Day, skipping all that turmoil and the ballot counting and all of those conversations and Trump declaring victory and yada, 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 whatever. Getting past that point, it wouldn't have been shocking. Why? Because Biden was leading consistently, nationally by 6, 7, 8, 9 points. Statewide, 5, 6, 7 points, right? In some of the more close battleground states, 2, 3, 4 points. It translated to victories for Biden nonetheless, but still was something that we saw some reductions in support for Biden. For instance, he should have won North Carolina, did not win North Carolina. He should have won Florida, did not win Florida. And granted, North Carolina was a 1-point state for Trump, Florida a 3-point state for Trump. But at the end of the day, the race was in a much better place for Democrats back in 2020 by what the polls were telling us. Now, in this day and age, post Roe v. Wade, we also don't know. The polls could be underestimating Democrats for a second time, and not to mention that looking at what we saw from 2016 and 2020, the poll methodologies have made up for this quiet Trump vote in accounting for that hidden Trump vote. Whether that's giving him a boost or doing an intensive outreach into rural areas or not counting urban voters as likely voters, as we've seen in some polls in the states like Pennsylvania, you result with numbers that end up being more favorable for the former president. With all that being said, let's get into the real, juicy parts of this election so far. So, here's where we're at. 226 electoral votes for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. 219 for Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. What I think we are at right now is Donald Trump and J.D. Vance win North Carolina and Georgia. These are two states that I don't think the Democratic ticket is going to win as of right now. The early voting data is good for Democrats, largely, but now we're starting to see a change in that. The rural areas in Georgia are starting to shift more towards Donald Trump, and the early vote lead or even advantage that we saw in just the uptick in support really does indicate two things. Democrats are getting out their base, but so are Republicans. And at the end of the day, if Republicans aren't lagging behind the same way they were in 2020 when it comes down to who's voting early, Democrats are going to have to rely a lot on who turns out on Election Day. Do I think they can turn out and win Georgia? The answer is yes. Do I think that's going to happen today? The answer is no. And looking at North Carolina, same thing. I think we've started to see that Donald Trump has brought back some of that support. He's making amends with Brian Kemp in Georgia. Why? Because his advisors probably realize that when you distance yourself from the popular Republican governor who outran you by 9 points statewide, that probably isn't the wisest thing to do. Looking at North Carolina, he's distanced himself from Mark Robinson, who he used to herald as MLK Jr. on steroids. No longer the case. North Carolina now more favorable for Donald Trump. Both of these circumstances, although may seem minute, are races that are going to be decided by just thousands of votes, and slight decisions can make all the difference. North Carolina and Georgia being case studies for that. And I also think, too, Donald Trump wins Arizona. I think that abortion referendum will do a great service to Democrats down the ballot, but I'm not so confident on the presidential. New district-wide polling data that showed promising results in states like Pennsylvania showed bad results for Democrats in Arizona. Not enough to say that Arizona is doomed. That's why it's a tilt-red state. But for instance, Arizona's 2nd district. The House race is tied. The governor's race is the Democrats up by 9. The presidential race has Trump up by 9. Why does that matter? Well, Biden lost that district in 2020 after it was redistricted by roughly 8 points. 8 points to 9 points, a 1-point reduction. Not super significant, but slight changes. If Biden's only winning Arizona by 0.2%, chances are Kamala Harris is losing it by roughly half a point. So, the 11 electoral votes from Arizona go to Donald Trump. Democrats do have a bit of a saving grace, though. They have a saving grace in states like Wisconsin and Michigan, where right now I do think the Democratic ticket is just so slightly ahead. Now, I'm not thoroughly convinced that Democrats are in a position where they are going to slam dunk the Rust Belt at all. And I think that's why it's a tilt, blue state too. Back in September, I had these states as lean blue, and I thought that was right for the time, and honestly, it was right for the time. This is right for today. Wisconsin and Michigan, states that Kamala Harris can and probably will win, but by the narrowest of margins. The reduction in support we've seen from the Arab American communities in Michigan, Detroit, Dearborn, wherever it might be, loss in support, though I do think can be propelled by suburban shifts, just as we saw in 2022. Wisconsin, not as much of a loss in base support, but just an overall close and contentious race that Wisconsin always tends to lend itself to be, with the exception of the Obama era, and that means this state's going to be competitive again. I still think Kamala Harris has that slight upper hand. But when it comes down to the remaining 2 states, Nevada and Pennsylvania, I really have wavered back and forth on them. 3 days ago, I would have said Trump would win Pennsylvania. I don't know if that's the same answer today. 3 days ago, I would have said Kamala Harris wins Nevada. I don't know if that's the answer today. And I do think that's because there's a variety of different things that have changed. New data points out of Pennsylvania show more promising numbers for Kamala Harris. New data points out of Nevada show more promising numbers for Donald Trump. And with that alone, I think given the race has already been so contentious, I do think that Donald Trump wins the state of Nevada, putting him at 268 electoral votes. But I do think Kamala Harris narrowly pulls ahead in Pennsylvania. Now, this honestly is a nightmare scenario for the American public, might I say. A 270 to 268 map leaves so much room for any individual elector who wants to make a name for themselves, an elector that wants to go faithless. But even if it doesn't, let's assume we're not going to go down the pathway of Democrats abandoning their ticket because they only did it in 2016 as of late, and looking at what would happen after that. A certification of an election result decided by 2 electoral votes. Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, 3 states that Donald Trump contested in the 2020 election. The closeness of the race delegitimizes it for many Americans. Donald Trump, I can near guarantee, will go immediately to the press and say this election is rigged. We might be in for another insurrection, which is the most fearful part of this all. Now, I'm not trying to say this from a partisan standpoint. I do think that objectively, when you look at what has happened in the aftermath of the 2020 election, this scenario is a nightmare scenario when it comes down to how we will see the coverage of this play out. I guarantee you the story on Fox News will be very different than the story on CNN. And that's just how things are in American politics. But 270 to 268 also speaks to the contentiousness of this election. Nothing can further exemplify just how close and narrow this race has felt and has been than a 270 to 268 map. And in a way, it's kind of fitting in this conclusive era on the Donald Trump candidacy and a new era in Kamala Harris's name. Now, this isn't a guarantee. The map could look very different, and Donald Trump could be at 312 electoral votes come November, and this could be entirely wrong, which is why I think it's more safe keeping them as tilt states, and I also think by margin, all 7 of these states will be decided by less than a point. The investments, the time, the resources, all of it seems to indicate that Democrats and Republicans are roughly even in these states, and only minute things are really going to make a difference between now and Election Day. As of now, I do think Kamala Harris loses Nevada based on my own prediction back from October 10th, but still narrowly pulls out ahead. But the trend line here isn't looking so good. 2 weeks ago, I had Kamala Harris at 292 electoral votes. Then it was 276. Now it's at 270. Should this trend line continue between now and Election Day, Donald Trump would be the projected winner in the next forecast. Now, that's not a guarantee. Things also can change. Donald Trump can have more campaign media cancellations. Things could be collapsing on his part. The media frenzy that we are going to see covering all those cancellations, it's not going to be good for the former president. But the question is, too, do voters actually care? We'll have to wait and see on that point. But as of right now, the election results that I think we will see, should you hold the election today, is 270 for Kamala Harris, 268 for Donald Trump. The closest election we have seen in a generation, and likely the closest to dictate future of competitive elections for many decades to come, and an honestly very fitting way to end the 2024 presidential election. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.